Hello, everyone. We are the group that worked with the Democratic Party on the March 6th primary election day. We are here to tell you about our observations as well as our experiences and the general trends that we could apply to voters in the projecting upcoming November election. And so my name is Graham Flieger. The group will consist of others, including Aaron Walker, Melody Lamborn, and Bobby Coons. And he's actually going to start off with voter registration.
Hey guys, so in order to vote, you have to be a citizen, at least 18 years of age. However, you can begin to file for registration if you are 17 years, 10 months of age. It takes about 30 days after you submit your application to be approved, and you can accomplish this in person at the Secretary of State's office, various voter registration offices, and many high schools, libraries, and post offices. Some kind of ID is required in order to participate in the elections. That can be a driver's license, concealed handgun license. There's others. You can have a military ID, a citizenship certificate, or your passport in order to vote. If you're unable to produce these documents, you can file a reasonable impediment form, and they'll discuss how to further and be able to vote. A voter registration certificate, it'll automatically renew every 2 years, unless you move, and then you actually have to file at one of the offices or apply online or change your address online through the Secretary of State's office. One interesting thing I learned working on election day was that convicted felons could vote once they've completed their parole and probation. They're allowed to take part in the election, so I thought that was interesting. Thanks.
Okay, so I will be discussing the information and observations I got from volunteering at the polls and how to use this to develop a strategy on how to best educate voters. First, focusing on so the most prevalent educator or method that voters used to pick their candidates was party identification, mostly because it was a closed primary and information of candidates was obtained strictly on a party basis. And there needs to be a different strategy. Oops, I'm in front of them. There. Different strategy needs to be used for each party. So you can go to the next slide. So starting off with the Republican voters, most prevalent were the Republican Party voters. More specifically, the older, married, white, religious, and wealthy. I picked up on the last two because I was working at a private suburban community, and a lot of people were on first name basis because they all attended, or they were all part of this community, suburban community, and they all knew each other from their church, their local church. Education on these. For these demographics needs to be specific. For example, according to the Pew Research in 2016, 72% of 50 to 64-year-olds and 85% of 65-year-olds get their news from TV. Therefore, attempting to reach these demographics through get out the vote movements on Facebook wouldn't reach this targeted audience near as effectively. The goal for the Republicans is much easier in this area, as we're educating Democratic voters in the area are substantial. It would focus on more like mobilization, and educating Democratic voters would be more challenging as they're statistically less likely to show up in the polls in this area, especially in the primaries. So for educating Democratic voters, they would have to focus on, one, convincing the voters that they have a chance against the Republican candidate. Also, they would include a lot of education as whereas the voting is occurring, the Democratic voters aren't showing up to the polls due to the lack of competition, so they would have to do more education on many fronts. Specific outlets to focus for educating Democrats would have to be based on educating racial minorities and women. These groups, according to the Pew Research Center, are more distinctly Democratic-leaning voter groups. According to the American Press Institute, both minority groups receive news from television and social media at the same consistency as white voters. Therefore, it'd be more strategic to focus on news sources that are party-based. For example, if CNN is attempted to educate Democratic voters and Fox News is attempting to target Republican voters, so focus on the specific news outlets. Also, lastly, to educate specific Democrat education is imperative to target female voters. The Pew Research Center also states that women are consistently more Democratic leaning. Therefore, targeting news sources women are more likely to use would be the most beneficial. Women are more likely than men to regularly watch network morning news and nightly news sources, said by the Texas Tribune this year, whereas men are more likely to get their news on talk radio sources. And so using these factors, you can best target these groups.
So one thing that kind of changed this primary election compared to past elections is the ability in Smith County where voters could vote in any of the precincts. In previous elections, if you were registered in Precinct 5, for example, you would have to go vote in Precinct 5 in order to properly vote. This year in Smith County, if I was registered in Precinct 26, and I think that I was in latter precincts in the 50s, then folks could come vote from wherever they wanted to. And we saw an increase of voter convenience and an increase of voter turnout that we saw, as Aaron's going to get to later, the voter turnout was in the 20% range. And I think that that's higher than we've seen in Smith County from in former primary elections, only seeing 3 to 4% voter turnout. So that definitely increased in Smith County. Specifically, though, even though that did increase the voter ability to go to vote wherever they wanted to precinct-wise, my personal experience getting to my precinct, there was a convenience issue and factor. First of all, when trying to get to the specific precinct in the church, there was a train track that separated the service road from the church voting location. And the train track was on a 2-foot tall hill. So it was a 2-foot tall hill going up and then a 3-foot down drop. In my truck, it wasn't that big of an issue, but in a Prius or in a smaller compact car, definitely could be some concern for getting to the poll safely. And secondarily, there was an instance of a poller needing to vote from their vehicle, from their car, and most of the pollers didn't know how to assist or how to adapt, but whenever they they found the manual, and we were able to assist the individual in casting their ballot. So it was cool to see that the precinct was accessible, even whenever we didn't originally know what to do. We found the right way to do it, according to the Texas Secretary of State. But also, another observation that we saw, not just in my precinct, but in Smith County and statewide, or what we saw in the Smith County ballot specifically, was that candidates that won their primary election had a majority of their ballots come from early voting and election day. So Louis Gomer, for instance, had 0.07% of his ballots mailed in. The rest of them that he won came from either early voting or election day. And they were about 50-50, or they were pretty evenly distributed between those two sources of income, that they were evenly distributed. And so we saw that not only in Louis Gomer's primary election, we saw that in multiple primary elections where there was a contested incumbent election that whoever ended up winning that primary election, that they had the majority of their votes coming from either early voting or election day, showing that early voting locations definitely increases the convenience for voters to come out and vote equally, if not more than the amount of votes on election day. And then Aaron's going to come in and talk about the voter turnout.
Okay, so the voter turnout, what we largely observed throughout our time out during election day was that a large majority of the people that we observed were elderly. The next largest group we observed were the middle age, around the age of 40 group, and the next smallest group that we observed was, of course, the younger generations. That is relatively normal as compared to other groups. Nearly all of our observations were of white folks, white constituents, with very little minority showings, especially in my district. There actually wasn't any person that was a noticeable person of color within my precinct at all. And overall, we found that there was a nearly equal turnout of men and women throughout the process of voting, because a lot of them came in as couples overall. But secondarily, this relates to the demographic in Tyler and is relatively equal to how we see Tyler's demographic, whereas the entire population of Tyler is 76% white. So of course we saw more white constituents at the voting polls anyway. And then secondarily, we also find that 52% of Smith County is female. So the differences between when we saw men and women is just slightly off. And then finally, the voter turnout for Tyler as of the data produced for the March 6th election was that 21% actually came out and voted, as compared to the people who had the ability to vote in Tyler. So that's relatively good, speaking comparatively to what it has been in previous elections. And through all the factors that Melody, Bobby, and Graham pointed out, there's been some alleviations that have led to that as well. And overall, we've seen a better voter turnout in our elections, and we were able to kind of pick it and choose and observe what went on during election day and how those people came in and flooded in, and how that was representative of the demographics and the status quo. And the end.